We need to talk about Betty Friedan and modern liberalism. This is going to be the final video on liberalism, and we've looked at 4 of the 5 key thinkers so far. She is our final one, and we're also going to be talking about how classic and modern liberals really compare. Where do they agree? Where do they disagree? Because all of your essays on liberalism at their core will be about these agreements, their disagreements. How does Locke agree and disagree with Mill? How does Mill agree and disagree with Rawls? And how do all of them agree and disagree with Betty Friedan? So let's get learning. So let's move myself to the middle here. So as I said in the introduction, and this is such an important part of political ideas, is that the questions that you are asked on political ideas will not ask you to compare liberalism to conservatism or liberalism to socialism, or even necessarily ask you, hey, what do you think about liberalism? Which is a bit of a shame, really, because that would be a really interesting debate and a conversation. But instead, what we'll ask you are academic questions about how united liberalism is around certain issues. So, for example, to what extent do liberals agree over the economy? Could be an example question. And there's various different ways they could ask these questions. And I suggest you look through past papers and sample papers to see the style of questions you'll get asked. But ultimately, where you need to be clear on these ideologies is what they are, what the core ideas, what the core thinkers stand for, and then where do all liberals agree with all other liberals? And it's normally going to be the core ideas. Like normally the core ideas will be the agreements between all of liberals or all of socialists. And then the disagreements tend to come as the ideology develops. So in the case of liberalism, the disagreements come as we move from classic liberalism through Mill, where we get some different views about kind of human nature, and then into modern liberalism under Rawls, where he brings out this idea that the state needs to be enlarged, which then, of course, impacts over to everything else. So this is where we need to be, or where you need to be, when you actually start to answer exam questions on this. So let's run through a few kind of bullet points here, and you might want to pause as you go here, and I suggest you expand on these ideas about agreements and disagreements. And I'm not going to explain them all, and it isn't even an exhaustive list, but it shows you the kinds of things that we are going to be kind of referring to. And so if we're talking about the disagreements, negative freedom versus positive freedom. If you're not sure what those words are, go and look them up. And nothing happened. The size and the role of the state, enabling state versus night watchman state. And therefore, taxation, an enabling state, needs far more funding than a classic liberal and small night watch state. Laissez-faire capitalism versus Keynesian economics. We will talk about Keynesian economics when we talk about other ideologies, but Keynesian economics is the idea that the state interferes with the economy to support businesses, to keep a steady economy. Laissez-faire capitalism is completely hands-off. You know, we're not going to get involved, kind of whatever happens. Let's move out of the way. The extent to which democracy and private property is regulated. I haven't covered all of these topics in all of my videos. Okay, this is a hopefully a slightly broader list. You should have done your own wider reading, either from your political ideas textbooks or your various other political textbooks. So please don't go back and expect all of these points to have been covered by me. But you could argue that actually liberals still agree with a heck of a lot, that they have a positive view of human nature, that we are rational, that we are individuals, that we are capable of making decisions for ourselves, we are capable of improvement. The importance of individualism, of course, although there is a disagreement over egotistical versus developmental. Rationalism, the capability of ourselves to make these decisions. Tolerance between diversity in society, whether that's job, religion, whatever. Capitalism, even though they disagree perhaps about the form of capitalism, they are all still capitalists. They all agree with government by consent, a form of democracy in some way in the social contract. And of course, rights, foundational and formal. So when you're writing an essay, you need to think, well, do they fundamentally agree with some minor disagreements? Or do they fundamentally disagree, but maybe they started in the same place? And so your essay needs to have a direction. It shouldn't just be a description of the agreements and a description of the disagreements. Like all politics essays, it has to have a direction. So, for example, if it said, to what extent liberals agree about the economy, you need to think, right, okay, am I going to argue that actually they broadly agree about the economy because they're all capitalist and they all agree in private property? But there are a few disagreements, but basically it's the same thing, but with some variations. Or do you want to go the other way and say, well, they all agree with capitalism and they all agree that there should be some form of private property, but fundamentally, they actually think they want a different kind of economic society because the government's going to be getting involved, there's going to be more taxation, there's going to be enabling state. And it doesn't matter which way you go. The examiner is not going to be saying, oh, this was right, this was wrong, but they are going to be saying, how well did you make that case that there was either more agreement than disagreement or more disagreement than agreement? Which brings us to our final key thinker. No, not me. I'll move myself out of the way. Betty Friedan. She's a 1960s feminist that helped to spark I believe it's the fourth wave of the feminist movement. Feel free to correct me in the comments if I'm right. Her book is called The Feminine Mystique, which was read by almost everyone at that time who was a kind of a feminist and was heavily involved in campaigns for rights. She was around during the campaign on abortion, although her views didn't necessarily always line up with other feminists at the time. And if you're looking to learn more about her, Google is your friend. But also, there's a TV series that came out, I think, last year called Mrs. America, which goes through the feminist movement in the 1960s. And each episode looks at a different individual in that movement. And I think it's brilliant. I thoroughly recommend it. It looks at the constitutional battle to enshrine women's rights into the Constitution. And it looks at women who were on both sides of that debate. And while doing so, it also looks at icons such as Betty Friedan. And that would be a wonderful way to kind of imprint these thinkers a little bit more into your mind and to understand, if you're doing American politics, how constitutional amendments work and how they can get stuck. Really, really good series. So I thoroughly recommend that one. And if you want to do some wider reading on feminism, then of course you can dip into The Feminine Mystique as well. So what does she think? What is she all about? Well, of course, she is a liberal. She is a liberal. So therefore, individual freedom is at the core of any liberal thinker. And again, going back to what I was saying in the introduction, that means all liberal thinkers are going to start off with this idea of kind of some sort of individuality, some sort of rationality, maximizing freedom. We've got some agreements here. But here's an interesting thing about her view on human nature. And this perhaps in some way differentiates her from Wollstonecraft, who was also clearly a feminist, is that Betty Friedan argued that human nature had allowed women to almost discriminate and be prejudiced against themselves, that they had been given a role, primarily kind of by men and by a patriarchal society, but then women had almost then kind of imprinted that on themselves and were almost then putting themselves in this, I must be a submissive housewife without a job type box. And so she said the real enemy is women's denigration of themselves. And so she wanted to, she argued passionately that women's kind of almost like psychology and views on themselves was needed to adjust. She argued, and this is a longer quote, the feminine mystique has made higher education for women seem suspect and dangerous. The kind of the demeanor of women had made the idea of educating them seem like something that society doesn't really want to do. And if you look at many of the kind of the world's ancient civilizations and religions, many of which are still kind of going today, there is this idea that women should not be educated because if you look at various religious texts, that they're too talkative or they don't understand and things like that. And Betty Friedan is passionately arguing here that education is so important for women to allow them to fulfill their potentials. Go back to the principles of liberalism in a meritocracy. Women were stopped at a state of evolution far short of their human capacity. Some would say, and I think Wollstonecraft said, I hope I'm not getting this thinking the wrong way around, that women were almost left in an infantile state, like childlike, because of this lack of education, this lack of development, them leaving far short of human capacity. Now, just to be very clear here, these thinkers are not saying women are childlike or women cannot have education and women have stopped. They're saying that this is what has happened and they should be allowed to receive education and to develop and to have the same opportunities as men, and so on. So this is a complaint, not an observation. But she also argued that a society, let me move out of the way here, a society regulated by a public sense of justice is inherently stable. Oh, is that from a previous thinker? I might just pause that one now on that one. So looking again at this idea of the far short of their human capacity and this idea that women are denigrating themselves, she argues that cultural conditioning needs to be challenged. We need to speak to those people that are kind of saying, "Oh no, I can't do this. I'm not capable of that. You know, that's not really a woman's role, or that's not really my thing." Or and that needs this cultural conditioning needs to be challenged. And that's what happened in the 1960s. That the traditional role of women in the family and in society was overtly challenged by this group, and through slow progress, women now have far more opportunities than they did before. But she also argued, because she is a modern liberal, that the state can enable women. So think about the enabling state versus the night watchman state. Betty Friedan is 100% on the side that the state shouldn't just be sitting there making sure everyone's safe, but the state should be getting involved to enable women to challenge these cultural preconceptions, to allow women to be educated, and ultimately to allow them to fulfill their human capacity. Um, so think through the various thinkers. You're not necessarily going to find that the thinkers always flat out disagree with each other. One might build on the work of the others. One might have, especially in the case of Friedan and Wollstonecraft, they won't necessarily disagree with the other thinkers that are there at the time, but more that their emphasis is far more onto the role of women in society. So you can use phrases in essays like "in the same way Mary Wollstonecraft said," or or developing these ideas, Betty Friedan said, and so sometimes you can bring in a disagreement, and sometimes it will be building on that work or giving a different edge to it. So where do we see liberalism today? And again, this is our final video on liberalism, so I just want to kind of round out kind of what's kind of happening with it. We see classic liberals and modern liberals. You can disagree with these observations, but arguably you see classic liberal economics in the policies of Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan in the 1980s, and perhaps David Cameron with his massive austerity push in the 2010s. There was very much a kind of an idea that the state should be getting smaller, should be doing less, and cuts to public services, cuts to taxes. You could very much argue that classic liberal economics is at the core of the Conservative Party today. However, it's currently 2021. The Conservative Party has had to deal with COVID, and therefore they are being a lot more to the left than perhaps they might naturally be. And so I'm recording this in September 2021, and the Conservatives have just raised taxes to pay for social care. That's not classic liberalism. So political parties kind of shift. But on the modern liberal side, we have Keynes from Keynesian economics. We have David Lloyd George, who was the one that introduced national insurance and started unemployment benefits. We have William Beveridge, who was the guy behind the Beveridge Report, which was written after World War II, who was talking about the five evils in society and like squalor and poverty and things like that. And so he was arguing the state needed to get involved and improve people's lives. I'm not 100% on this one, but if I had to put Tony Blair into an ideology, I might well argue that he was a modern liberal. He might personally disagree, but he believed in capitalism, and he believed in using capitalism to enable the state to improve things like kind of education. Whether or not he's a pure modern liberal, you can certainly see modern liberal ideas in the policies of New Labour from 1997 to 2010. But the story of liberalism is again a kind of a fascinating one. If we just kind of look at some of the kind of the tensions here to make you kind of see where there is tension. Human nature, you have a disagreement. Some of them think that rationality is just there from the beginning, innate, whereas some of them think rationality is potential. Some of them sticking on human nature, the idea that we are egotistically individual or that we are developmentally individual, the idea that we have empathy with others and wanting them to succeed as well. Looking at the state, do we just want freedom from the state, or do we want the state to give us positive liberty, give us freedom too by enabling us? Night watchman versus enabling state. With the economy, we want capitalism, but do we want laissez-faire capitalism, or do we want Keynesian capitalism? Do we want a society which is just pure individualism, or do we want this kind of state-supported enabling individualism that will support women, like Betty Friedan was arguing? And these are just some of the kind of the disagreements, but you can see in these ideas here how an essay might start to be formed. So as a final thought in our look at liberalism, and I hope you found these videos useful, and if you have, please please like it, subscribe to the channel, give me a nice comment, blah blah blah. I'd like to look at the history of how liberalism has kind of changed over time, and I made this slide a couple of years ago, so it's probably a little bit out of date now. But what we can see is, and in looking in the last kind of 40 years, is that many people argued that liberalism had become the dominant ideology of the planet. We get the collapse of communism and the USSR in the mid to late 1980s. So communist states fail economically, and so the most dominant states in the planet, obviously America, are liberal, and almost all countries embrace a form of capitalism in the 1990s. Even China these days uses a version of state-sponsored capitalism. And there was a guy called Francis Fukuyama, and I don't know, I've got him on there, who wrote an article called The End of History, where he argued that, look, liberal democracy has won. This is the end of history. This is the end of our great conflict between the West and the East. And he argued that liberalism, in effect, had become the ideology for humanity. And you can see this in the fact that we have an enhanced social equality since the 1960s, women's rights, abortion rights, gay rights, now transgender rights, racial equality legislation, and most of this is statute now as well, formalized. Liberty and individualism has been further enhanced by the internet because it allows us all to really be who we want to be kind of online, to have more kind of like diverse interests and passions. And even New Labour, who was perhaps on the left more towards socialism in the past, or Labour, moves towards liberalism. So the political parties were effectively converging around this ideology of liberalism, and the Conservatives were becoming more socially liberal, and Labour was becoming more economically liberal. So it was like in the late 1990s and early 2000s, it was like the whole world had converged around liberalism, and job done, the world is now liberal. However, that's not quite the end of the story, because there has been a kind of a movement against liberalism since then. Oh, sorry, I missed one out here. Improved constitutional government, especially in the UK, the creation of the Supreme Court, the codification of many of the of UK's laws and things like that. You can see a liberalisation of the constitution. I know that Britain doesn't have a codified constitution, but constitutional statutes have become more liberal and more written and clearer, which is definitely more liberal. But, and I've probably shouted that a little bit loud, but there have been challenges to liberal values from lots of different angles. Firstly, through terrorism, 9/11, you get religious fundamentalists who believe that God doesn't agree with certain liberal values, such as the rights of women and gay rights, or perhaps they see American democracy as forcing kind of Christianity on other states, and they kind of don't like that, or they want to enforce, or as we've seen in Afghanistan, that there are certain people that want to enforce their religion on an entire country. That is a challenge to liberal values. We also have a conservative response to liberal values. So think about what's happened with the Supreme Court. I don't know when you'll be watching this video, but the Supreme Court in America has just made a ruling kind of allowing the right to abortion to be challenged in Texas. And Donald Trump has put many more right-wing judges on the US Supreme Court that are not as liberal as the ones that came. The 2008 financial crash massively challenged the wisdom that free markets are the way forward and how the economy should be run, because when left to its own devices, it led to a massive crash that impacted the world. And so there's been a lot more restrictions put on the economy since then. there has been a rebirth of the religious right in Western society, whether it's kind of Christianity in America, and there is a stronger thread running through kind of Eastern and Asian and Middle Eastern religions as well. Although there are far more atheists than there have been in the past. There has also been a big anti-immigration and pro-nationalism movement, whether we're talking, and I'm sure you're thinking here about kind of like Brexit or America First or whatever it might be, or Make America Great Again. All these movements are anti-immigration, which is anti-freedom, anti-movement, anti-globalization. Ideally, most liberals would believe in a global society where freedom of movement is allowed, where people can kind of live where they want, can do what they want, can compete internationally. But nationalism and anti-immigration feeling goes against those freedoms, and you then are getting populist movements challenging liberal consensus. If you don't know what populism is, that's fine. We can talk about it another time. But if you do know, you'll probably understand that most populist movements do not tend to be going with liberal values. And I made this slide a couple of years ago, but Brexit, Jeremy Corbyn, Donald Trump, you can see these as all reactions against liberalism. Now, of course, Brexit was now 5 years ago. Jeremy Corbyn is no longer leader of the Labour Party. Donald Trump is no longer the leader of the President of America. But the influence and the attitudes that put them there are still very much around. So it is possible to see that it is possible to argue that liberalism peaked in maybe the year 2000, maybe before 9/11. But it's also possible to argue that liberalism is actually still at the core of what we do today, and actually these movements are important but haven't made as big a impact. So there we go. That is liberalism. I hope you found these videos useful. I'm not going to run through this slide now because I've done it. I hope you found these videos useful and you've learned a lot. Again, if you could subscribe and like the channel and tell your friends, that would be great. And I will see you for conservatism real soon. Bye-bye.